Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us this evening and sharing your book with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for everyone who's gathered here and watching.
Good, good. So we're still getting a few folks coming in. If we could just begin, Jessica, with kind of a basic question just to situate ourselves. We're getting a few arrivals. The idea of depression, what do we mean when we speak of depression? It's a term we kind of maybe use a little bit loosely. We can sometimes say I feel depressed and maybe not have the whole medical idea behind of it. What should we be aware of with depression? What are people experiencing who have it? How should we think about this term?
It's a great question to start off with, Michael, because I think you're right. A lot of us, either ourselves or in listening to other people talk about their experience of the world, speak quite casually about depression, about feeling depressed. And I think especially right now, having endured and continuing to endure this really difficult time of global pandemic, a lot of us are feeling not as we might ordinarily feel, and are experiencing some psychological distress in new ways. On one hand, I think that it's a good sign that people feel more comfortable kind of identifying with mental health conditions like depression. I think a lot of people are looking for language to talk about what they're experiencing. On the other hand, I think there can be an unintended consequence of sort of diminishing the distinctiveness and sometimes severity of depression by throwing around the term so casually. Sometimes people say, if everyone's depressed, then no one's depressed, right? And it's not uncommon for me to hear, things like, everybody experiences depression sometimes. I think what people often mean when they say things like that is that everybody has bad days. Everybody experiences crises or losses in their lives that leave them feeling psychologically distressed and burdened, sometimes for really extended periods of time. That is quite normal. It is something that everybody goes through. But as I started to study depression, what I found was that a lot of depression sufferers describe something quite different than this kind of ordinary sadness that we all experience in our day-to-day lives. Depression sufferers describe a sort of radical shift in their experience of the world over an extended amount of time, where they talk often about a significant diminishment or loss in just the kind of possibilities that are available to them in their everyday lives. They feel like they've lost a sense of freedom and agency, the ability to do things that they couldn't do before. And this isn't just, again, a bad day. It's, despite how much they try, they can't access the will to do things in the same way they used to. They experienced diminished or wholly evaporated senses of hopelessness. They can't perceive a future in the way that most of us, most of the time, do quite readily. They also talk about a diminished sense of connection, right? When we meet, Michael, when we talk, we often almost unconsciously presume that we can understand each other, that we probably have some sort of shared experience as human beings in the world. As people, we're not often conscious of this, but we just presume it in our everyday interactions. And people who are living with the kind of depression that's at the focus of this book say that sense of connection that they often took for granted as they moved through their day is suddenly not available to them. It's no longer there in the way that it used to be. You can imagine how a diminished sense of agency and futurity, a sense of the future and hope, and a sense of connection being lost could not only be hard, but really kind of scary, right? To lose the things that often we take for granted, but that often make our lives good, right? A sense of belonging, a sense of hope for ourselves. It's the loss of those things that sufferers often say are the hardest part of depression, and what makes it really different than the kind of ordinary bad days or even sort of common experiences of grief that they have experienced at other points in their lives.
Mm. That is particular when you say loss of hope, it has particular spiritual connotations when I hear that. There's almost like a loss of eschatological hope or a hope of something to come, which in a Catholic or Christian context really I can only assume adds to the suffering. Um,
Yes.
yeah. You speak, Jessica, and this might tie on to what you were just saying. Maybe you could talk a bit about this concept in your book that comes up of unhomelikeness, which is one of those Germanic kind of, we put a lot of concepts together in one word. It's just such a striking term. Could you maybe speak a little bit about this term and how it fits into your theology of depression?
Mhm. Yeah, so I have been looking for ways to talk about the experience of depression in a way that reflects what depression sufferers themselves narrate about their experiences. I just mentioned a moment ago that depression sufferers often contrast their experience to their kind of previous sense of connection, futurity, or hope, and agency or freedom, right? These types of experiences are ones that philosophers, particularly those working in a field called phenomenology, often associate with sort of what they call everydayness or homelikeness in the world, right? When we feel at home in the world, we don't notice these things that we take for granted. We don't notice our sense of the future. We don't notice the possibility to do things in the world, to change course, to make decisions. We don't notice that we automatically have a sense of belonging and connection. It's taken for granted. That's the spirit experience of homelikeness. And it's when these possibilities that we take for granted are suddenly no longer available to us that people find themselves in this other state that I am calling unhomelikeness with these other philosophers. And one of the things that was striking to me about this particular term is not only that it kind of names a helpful contrast here, being at home in the world versus feeling not at home in the world, but also for depression sufferers who aren't philosophers, who aren't using this kind of technical language, what they often do with a sort of striking regularity in depression memoirs is draw upon imagery or metaphors to describe their experience. And it's often spatial metaphors that have a lot in common with this language of unhomelikeness. People talk about being displaced into another world. They feel like, they're in hell. Sometimes it's that kind of religious spatial imagery, or a purgatory. Or a prison. That's another sort of common metaphor. But I think one of the reasons why this spatial imagery is so common in depression memoirs is that it conveys just how encompassing the experience is, right? It's not an internal shift that you notice, like a burst of joy or being struck with sadness. It's something that sort of people describe as taking over every aspect of their lives. It weighs them down in their body. And so I think this spatial imagery of being, kind of exiled to another world, this unhomelikeness captures just how encompassing it is in a way that's really important for understanding what the condition is like.
Mm, interesting. That might maybe I was going to save this for a bit, but because you just used the term exile and thinking in the spatial imagery, maybe we could move a bit to, and this is a key part of your book, there's probably a lot of questions within this one theme, but the idea of depression as a wilderness experience. It's I mean, it's a profound way to think about it. And I don't quite know where to start. Maybe we could maybe ground it. Your kind of central image in the text is this image of Hagar. And
Mhm.
maybe we could talk a little bit about, for those of us who might not remember who Hagar was in the Bible in Genesis, um, her story, just some key parts of her story, but also the idea that, you know, this particular suffering might not have meaning right away. It might need time. We might be exiled to a place where we can make meaning or tell our own stories. I know there's a lot there, but maybe you could just start with Hagar, and we could kind of think about depression as a wilderness experience.
Mhm. Yeah, happy to. So, I, as a Christian theologian, the more that I thought about these depression narratives, these memoirs of depression, and the recurrent imagery of being displaced into another world, the more I realized that Christians have a long history of talking about analogous experiences. They Christians haven't necessarily dedicated so much time to talking about depression in particular, but they have talked for a long time about experiences of feeling displaced into another very difficult landscape. Um, and one example of that is the stories of the wilderness that run throughout the Old and New Testament, where in so many ways, uh, the scriptures talk about individuals and groups of people who willfully or forcefully find themselves in an unfamiliar place and face a great deal of struggle as they try to learn to live in a different landscape. And so the just sort of kind of experiential similarities between these stories of depression and the stories of wilderness in the scripture stuck out to me as a potentially rich way to kind of bring the contemporary experience of depression into the biblical narrative. But one of the things that I found as I started to do that is that there's so many different stories of the wilderness once you start looking for it. Some of these stories are really hopeful. I talk at one point in the book about Abraham being commissioned by God to pick up his life and travel to the land of Canaan. He faces a lot of trials along the way. Abraham has a lot of anxieties about it, but his journey through the wilderness and this unfamiliar territory is animated by a sense of purpose and direction and hope. God has a mission for him, and that shapes his experience of the wilderness in a particular way. I could go on with myriad examples, but what I started to realize, and I can continue to use this story of Abraham's journey as one example, is that if we were to think about depression as a contemporary sort of analogy, an analog to Abraham's experience of the wilderness, we might think of depression really optimistically, right? Or really, really positively, because Abraham sort of had a clear sense of purpose, right? So too, we might assume that, you know, depression sufferers might feel like, just like Abraham, God has a purpose for my struggle through this unfamiliar territory that is depression. But I knew from reading depression memoirs that lots of sufferers don't feel like that. They don't feel like Abraham's story of the wilderness is their story of the wilderness. And so one of the things that I felt was important to do was to find stories of the wilderness that actually introduced new ways of thinking about depression and suffering more broadly, ways that tracked much more closely with how depression sufferers describe their own experience, which is what led me to Hagar. Some of our viewers may know the story of Hagar. Her story is part of Abraham's story, actually. She was a slave in the clan of Abraham, who Abraham's wife, Sarah, sort of gives to Abraham in order to provide him with a child. You may recall that, you know, part of the covenant that God made with Abraham was that Abraham would have offspring, and that, you know, God would be the God of generations of his progeny. because of that, it was a problem that Abraham and his wife were barren. So as was a common practice at the time, unfortunately, the enslaved Hagar was given to Abraham to provide a child. And unfortunately, Sarah was jealous of Hagar, mistreated her, and in Genesis 16, Hagar flees Abraham and Sarah and their clan and goes into the wilderness out of kind of fear for her situation. Very strikingly there, Hagar encounters God, the God of Israel, Abraham's God, names God, the God who sees. She's the first figure in the chronology of the scriptures to name God, interestingly. But in her conversations with God, God tells the pregnant Hagar to actually return to Sarah and Abraham. And so she does that. Eventually she births this child, Ishmael. And once again, the story goes, once Sarah had a child of her own, Sarah became very jealous of this other child and his mother, Hagar. And so this time, it wasn't Hagar who fled to the wilderness. She's actually forced out into the wilderness by Abraham and Sarah, where, to the best of our knowledge in the text, Hagar is left to live with her son for the rest of her life. The scriptures tell us that in this second wilderness experience, this forced wilderness experience, Hagar quickly finds herself in death-bound situations because she's without water. She has this child who she perceives as on the brink of death, and she cries out to God for help. It's at that time where God responds to her by not only kind of verbally, but also God opens Hagar's eyes to a well of water that she was not able to see when she first cried out to God. This water saves her and her child. And the text suggests that this is the kind of a first crucial incident that allows them to survive and live on, perhaps with an improved quality of life as they continue to live in this really difficult landscape. One of the things that there are many things about the Hagar story that stuck out to me as relevant to thinking about depression. Right. For one, Hagar is forced into this wilderness, just like a lot of depression sufferers feel like they have no control over when depression kind of onsets in their lives. So it's a forced experience. She finds herself there. And it's a really dangerous place to be. As I'm sure many viewers know, depression really not only threatens the very best of life for a lot of people, but can be kind of life-threatening in some circumstances. And I think that's reflected in Hagar's own experience. Her life is really in danger, and she doesn't see a way forward for her and her son. She thinks they will die there because she cannot perceive how they could possibly go on living in this place. Leading up to this wilderness experience, and even in God's interactions with Hagar in the wilderness, in her desperation, God does not reveal to her some greater purpose for her experience. This is a contrast to Abraham and his commission to Canaan. God does not say, Hagar, this is all for some greater good, or Hagar, you're here because you sinned and this is your punishment. That's something that God does reveal to other people in the wilderness at different points in the scriptures. God doesn't say to her, like, this is a test, hang in there. God doesn't give any sort of justification or purpose for her suffering. There's no sort of meaning that's revealed to her. This is just her situation, and God is there, and God helps her make a way in the wilderness. the womanist theologian Dolores Williams says, God helps her make a way out of no way. She could not have survived on her own, but just the ability to recognize the resources that she needed to survive, this well of water that God reveals to her, that's enough to at least help her survive and live a bit better. These features of Hagar's story, I think, resonate a lot with how many depression sufferers, and in particular Christian depression sufferers, talk about their experience, right? A lot of them say, like, it doesn't feel like there's any meaning in this suffering. In fact, one of the sort of experiential characteristics of depression is that sometimes people say they struggle to find meaning in their lives. They lose the ability to do that in their depression.
Yes.
And so the fact that this story is a story about God, about God's care and concern for a suffering person, the fact that God is there and cares and concerns, but also doesn't say, like, this has to mean one thing, I think is so important for Christian depression sufferers. It's a message we don't often hear. Right?
Very rarely hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that was a really key part of your book, because it opens it up. You open up this story where the possibility of meaning is in no meaning, and having to deal with that and having to create space for the fact that this might not mean anything, which kind of brings me, Jessica, to the next question I wanted to pose to you, which is more on our personal responses to depression. It tends to be in Christian responses. You kind of bring this up in the book, but I intuited as much even before I read that there's two basic responses. It's either some type of moral judgment on you, or it's you're supposed to have a lesson from this. This is something God's provided to you to draw out, a new dimension of yourself, which could be well and good, and people could find sustenance in either of those things. What do you see as the problem with those two main approaches? And alternately, could you maybe suggest other approaches or other ways we can open up space for depression sufferers to tell their own stories in Christian context or not?
Yeah. I have encountered depression sufferers who take great solace in these kinds of common Christian explanations, that even the explanation that depression is some sort of punishment for sin. Like, some people feel like, at least I understand why this is happening to me. Like, and at least I understand why it's happening to me. Okay, I was sinful. And two, I guess I can do something about it. I'll repent from my sin. I'll do it. There are people who sometimes counterintuitively to others, like, find solace in these explanations. The problem that I see with these is that these are often thrown around as explanations for depression, regardless of what depression sufferers themselves are experiencing. So, for example, when we tell people, your depression is a result of your sinfulness, you must have done something to bring this on. You weren't faithful enough. You're not trying hard enough to be a good Christian. That's why you're experiencing this. There are sufferers who will say, I repented from my sin. I swear I'm trying. I don't feel like I have control over this. If the only explanation we give them is this kind of moral diagnosis, and it doesn't track with their experience at all, then they're left with nothing. Like, what else is there, right? There's nothing that we're offering them as fellow Christians to help them navigate this tradition, or the Christian tradition, yes, but also this condition of depression. Likewise, with what I think is often a really well-meaning message that, everything happens for a reason. God is, giving you this trial so that you'll learn something. Suffering makes you stronger. God has a plan for you in this. People often say this as a means of comfort, but when people don't experience meaning, like, what are they left with? They end up feeling like bad Christians because they can't see the bright side of this really horrifying condition. Furthermore, I think those kinds of explanations for depression neglect neglect the reality of depression sufferers who die by suicide, who never experience a silver lining or a lesson learned from this. And so it's the imposition of these theological explanations that really, I think, erase a lot of depression sufferers' own experiences, including sometimes experiences of meaninglessness. And there's a way in which it sort of ties depression sufferers' hands, right? If we're only giving them one sort of Christian explanation, then they have to either accept it or reject it. And if they reject it, we put them in a position where we're depriving them of this faith community that has a potential to offer support to people who are suffering so much. To me, what is so important to offer depression sufferers in light of that is an expansion of Christian interpretations about depression, like to not impose one Christian interpretation of this condition, but rather to offer depression sufferers tools to think in many ways about their conditions and to accompany them in trying to, situate their particular experience within the really rich Christian story and stories that we have. That was part of why I wanted to lift up the story of Hagar in particular, because I saw her story as offering a sort of different Christian interpretation of depression. Maybe it's a really hard thing, like all wilderness experiences, and maybe God is present to it and cares about it, but we don't know why it happens. That should be a valid possibility for Christians, just as much as these other kind of stories that we tell about suffering.
You introduced on that point I'll actually read it because I think I was very, it was a very striking moment in the book where you talk about the spiritual author Parker Palmer, and a woman is suffering from depression. She comes to him and asks his spiritual counsel. And he can only come up with, she says, why do some people kill themselves and others get well? I mean, it's a very, heart-wrenching question. He says, I can only come up with one response. I have no idea. So he admits that he has no magic word for this. And a few days later, she writes to him and says that of all they had talked about, that is what stayed with her, this idea that he had no idea. And so I think that speaks a little bit to it might be cold comfort in the moment, but a little bit of the mystery at the heart of this, and kind of remembering the mystery, if that can be a gateway to another kind of story.
Yeah.
So that was a really profound illustration of, I think, the point that you were just making. Maybe we could pivot, Jessica, to from kind of the personal response understanding to what our church maybe gets wrong about this. And so there might be some overlap with the personal responses, obviously, but what is our church not doing right? What are some things maybe we are doing right that the Catholic Church is doing right? What are some things that they could be improving on? However you'd like to take that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things that I do in the book, that kind of, I included it in the book because I found it really fascinating myself, is there's a really interesting body of social scientific literature that has given us a picture of how different Christian communities in the United States tend to talk about mental illness, including depression. And one thing that this research shows is that in a lot of evangelical Pentecostal communities in the United States, there is a tendency, a very strong tendency to spiritualize depression, to say that, this is not a medical condition, this is a spiritual condition. And that means you need to, if you have depression, you need to pray, you need to repent. The narrative that depression is a result of a sufferer's sinfulness is much more common in these communities that tend to spiritualize depression. I think it's a good thing that Catholics tend not to spiritualize depression in this way. They tend not to spiritualize depression at the exclusion of, say, recognizing the importance of medical perspectives on depression, the insights of the psychological sciences. This may simply stem from the fact that the Catholic Church makes it clear that, science and faith are amenable to one another. And I think that's reflected in an openness to psychiatry, psychology, and other forms of mental health care in Catholic communities. However, I sometimes see how that also can manifest in detrimental ways. I often hear from Catholics that essentially that depression is a disease, therefore it doesn't have anything to do with faith. So it's kind of the opposite extreme from the spiritualization of the condition. And I think we miss something as Catholics when we do that too. I think it's very important to affirm medical perspectives, psychological perspectives on depression and the great things that medication and counseling can do for depression sufferers, while also acknowledging that there are a lot of spiritual struggles and theological questions that often emerge as people are struggling with these conditions, right? It's often in hours of distress that people ask really important existential questions about God, like, where is God? Why is this happening to me? How do I respond to this as a person of faith? These kinds of questions are theological questions. And I think if we resign to only the medicalization of this condition, the church misses opportunities that it's uniquely equipped to address as a community of faith. So I think that's one misstep. I think also Catholic communities that are acknowledging mental illness often talk about it exclusively as an individual problem. And this is, I think, reflective of larger societal habits of talking about mental illness, right? It's because I experienced depression, I need to seek out, the individual care that I need. And churches are making strides to acknowledge at times the reality that members of their congregations are struggling with these conditions. But I regret that that's often done at the expense of recognizing that depression is also a collective issue and a social justice issue that has societal dimensions that faith communities, as communities, I think are uniquely equipped to address. So, for example, I might be struggling with depression, but ideally, like, there are kind of there should be, let me put it this way, kind of collective systems of care within churches and within broader communities to kind of help support people. Like, are people pooling resources? Are they coordinating to support people in ways that you can't really do one-on-one? Whether it's people's really simple things, like I think of like a mother who's experiencing postpartum depression. Yes, she needs to seek out mental health care, but like, it would be great for churches to say, we want to help take care of your kids, to give you a break, or wash the dishes, or cook some food. One person can take on that support role, but why not communities, right?
Right.
Also, increasingly there's a recognition that social justice issues like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, these social realities often contribute to and magnify the suffering of depression. This is evident in really jarring statistics about the disproportionate numbers of severe mental illness among transgender persons, for example. Um, and, you know, churches, as people concerned with justice in our world, and for the poor and vulnerable, should be mobilizing to address these kinds of systemic bias, not just because, one, because they're wrong, but two, because if they care about mental health in their communities, they should care about these issues too, these social issues too. And one person of goodwill can't fix these social problems. Again, communities, communal problems require communal solutions.
Right.
And faith communities, I think, could do so much more. I could just go on about the things I don't want to dominate, but I mean, mental health care access is another thing that I would love to see churches advocate for.
Yeah, it's of a piece with a broader push for, more comprehensive medical care, more robust care that doesn't stigmatize mental illness, as we've seen. There was a
Yes.
piece today in the New York Times about, I don't know if you saw, but a doctor had written an op-ed about how it's stigmatized among physicians to seek
Mm,
mental health care. And she said, I have to state this because we're burning ourselves out, working 100 hours a week, and we're kind of, I don't want to say told that we're weak, but we're steered away from seeking this out. So it needs to be, like you say, a broader effort
yes.
to
Yeah,
stigmatize the care and give people the
absolutely.
care. Yeah,
Absolutely. And I think things like, church communities, this is something my own faith community here often does, is they'll include a prayer for those who are struggling with mental illness in the kind of petitions on a Sunday. That is something that's super easy to do, that communicates to a person like this physician that, like, we care. It's okay to acknowledge that people are living with this, in our community and elsewhere. That can make a huge difference with kind of destigmatizing the condition. But as I said, that's also a pretty easy thing to do. And I want churches to also do the harder thing, which is not only saying it's okay to
yeah,
have mental illness, but also, like, you need help finding a counselor. We have people who are willing to help you do that. Um, you need help finding health insurance. We have people to help you do that. Those things take a lot more effort, but I think that's the kind of thing that we're called to as people of faith.
yes, definitely. I think too, kind of on the theological portion of it, or some of the theological work that can be done. There's a quote, and I'll give to you, that I think was very spot on. You say Christians can likewise critique the illusion of absolute self-governance, which runs counter to the fundamentals of Christian anthropology, and which shames sufferers who cannot will themselves out of depression. And I thought that was just really well put. And it's true, this kind of idea of the autonomous self, and I'm kind of, creating myself from the ground up. Maybe this is a chance to puncture some of those myths.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We can't all be happy, productive people all the time. And we know that, but I think it's so easy to hide those parts of our lives that don't live up to that expectation. And I think if we're not careful, even, in our preaching, in our literature, in our, even like the images that we use around our church buildings and on our websites, sometimes you just get the impression that everyone is living a perfect life.
Right.
And so if we are not explicit in presenting the theological truths of our own tradition that say, like, no, we are fragile people, we are vulnerable people, we are imperfect people, we are people who depend on one another in order to survive, not to mention thrive. Like, if we talked more about that and became more comfortable with that, then I think it would put us all in a better position to deal with mental health struggles if we come upon them, but also to respond more graciously and generously when others around us are experiencing them.
Mm, amen. Maybe, I don't know, this might be a spot, if anybody has any questions or things that they'd like to share or ask, maybe we could open the floor for a moment. I know maybe I have a few more things we'd like to touch on, but otherwise we can save them for later. But I don't know if anybody has anything to chime in with. I'll give a second. Otherwise, I wanted to maybe talk a bit, Jessica, about, we've talked about kind of taking down the meaning and maybe giving people space to tell their own stories, and that is kind of being a key component of healing. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about, you talk a lot in the book, or at least in a section, about the power of the imagination, kind of working to, the need for imagination to imagine new stories. You talk about the tragic imagination, bring in Rowan Williams, and about maybe we need to, refamiliarize ourselves with Greek drama, and he has some really interesting ideas about how we can change the way we're thinking about things so that this is more of a part of our daily consciousness. Could you talk a bit about maybe the role of the imagination in healing from depression, or in helping people tell their stories or name their condition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think there's a sort of individual message about imagination and a collective message about imagination in the book. In terms of the role of imagination and the role of healing, as I mentioned earlier, depression is often characterized by this sort of collapse in possibility for people. They struggle to imagine the future. They struggle to make meaning. They struggle to imagine their lives being any different than they are in this moment of really, really difficult struggle. And following the work of Jesuit William Lynch, who writes really beautifully about hope and imagination, one of the things that I observe is that for people who are experiencing this sort of collapse in hope, in their ability to hope, often we need other people to help us hope. Lynch says, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but he says, like, hope is a communal act, right? I, as an individual, can only imagine so much for my life. But if I have people who will come alongside me and we imagine together what my life could be, what our lives could be, there's a sense that it expands the boundary of what we can imagine for ourselves. I think that's true all the time in the best of health, but I think it's especially vital to keep this kind of collective dimension of hope in mind for those who are suffering from depression. And one of the things that I try to do as a theologian in this book is to help depression sufferers kind of expand their own imaginations in a little bit through stories like Hagar. I think the stories of the scriptures do this all the time for us. We see ourselves in these stories, and they help us think about our lives in a different way. And for me, the story of Hagar did that. It helped me see. I recognized sort of similarities to depression, but I also saw through her own experiences with God, that maybe God could be present to this kind of suffering, even if the suffering still didn't make any sense. So I think there's a way in which we can help depression sufferers, individuals who are struggling, by accompanying them as they try to imagine a future and a good life for themselves amid this. The collective dimension of this, though, that sort of accompaniment requires that people of faith themselves have a more expansive imagination, because I think particularly in American society today, we are so socialized to seek quick fixes.
Yes.
And as I think I love, Pope Francis often talks about this sort of culture of comfort. We often we love to be busy and distract ourselves from the bad things in the world, all the more so now when we have so much, inundation of the bad stuff of the world. It's easy to just be like, you know what, I can't take it. And I'm only gonna, binge Netflix, which is,
Right.
one of my guilty pleasures. There's a place for that. But if we sort of get in the habit of ignoring persistent suffering and only paying attention to suffering that has a quick fix, then we're gonna fail when we try to accompany depression sufferers.
Right.
When we accompany them, we're not going to have much to offer them. We're going to only have these messages like, it'll get better tomorrow. God has a plan. These are those, there must be some reason behind this. Let me tell you why you have depression. Those are the theologies of the quick fix. And so I think we need to expand our own imaginations of how suffering that doesn't go away, suffering that doesn't have an explanation, can fit into the Christian worldview. And Rowan Williams, he, as you mentioned, kind of points to the kind of ancient Greek plays, particularly tragedies, as a way that communities, these ancient Greeks, used to, as a group, sort of bear witness to the stories of their own community that had no sense to them. There's no logic to a tragedy. It's one mishap after another, and everybody's good intentions, the good intentions don't protect them from, the horrors of history. And he kind of argues that, like, maybe we need to practice as a community kind of bearing witness to the stories in our own world that are unresolved, that don't make sense, that don't go away. Maybe if we practiced that more,
Yes.
we would have the kind of imagination as Christians that can hold a place for people who have suffering in their lives that doesn't have a fix. Only then, I think, will we be equipped to accompany depression sufferers in the way that they need, I think.
It's when you said the horrors of history, I think I remember reading somewhere that after his brother was assassinated, Robert Kennedy got very interested in Greek tragedy and was reading it deeply and kind of as a way to cope or just try and understand. So it speaks a little bit to what you're saying. Maybe we could kind of bring some of these threads together and just think on kind of a practical basis. If people, if someone is trying to accompany a depression sufferer in their life, what should that accompaniment look like? What should kind of a daily effort look like? Is it a daily check-in? Is it a praying together? Is it, some of these imaginative exercises that you're talking about? What are some practical things people can do if they're saying, hey, I'd like to help so-and-so who's really suffering?
Mm-hmm. Really important question. The first thing I would recommend is that people kind of take the initiative to acquire some basic mental health literacy, because as we sort of noted throughout, there's a lot of misunderstandings about conditions like depression. Sometimes that takes the form of like stereotypes about depression, but often there's just sort of a general kind of ignorance about what these conditions are like and what people really need when they're experiencing them. There's lots of organizations that provide, that are just a Google away, that provide information about the basics of how to help somebody who is going through depression. So one organization is NAMI, N-A-M-I. It's an acronym. They're an organization here in the United States that has lots of easily accessible literature on all sorts of different types of mental illness. And it has things like phone numbers and websites that you can access for more information yourself, or that you can kind of pass along to a person in need. That's always there when you need it. Like I said, it's a Google away. That said, I think sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that we have to become experts in mental illness in order to help people. And I don't think that's the case. I think we talk a lot as Catholics, as Christians, about accompanying people in all sorts of suffering. And there, while I have emphasized that depression is a sort of distinctive form of suffering, and it is, there's also ways in which it's suffering like any sort of suffering. And when a person is in front of you and they are struggling, whether it's depression or something else, we know that there are certain things that help. We know that presence matters, a willingness to show up for them, to say, I want to come over, I'll sit with you. Just if if you're too tired, I just want to, would it help if I'm just there? I'm thinking of, Monica Coleman wrote this beautiful memoir of depression, and she talks about a difficult spell of depression that she had during college that really affected her sleep. She couldn't sleep. And she would have friends come over and just like sit on the couch until she fell asleep. And that made all the difference to her. Similarly, Parker Palmer again tells a story of a friend of his who used to come over. It was once a week, maybe it was more, I can't remember, who would wash his feet just like as an act of comfort. They wouldn't talk. He just.
Very Holy Thursday.
Yeah, very Holy Thursday. We're coming up on that. It's a good reminder. But like, it was just an act of love and of being present. I think, offering those things to people, continuing to offer them, reassuring them that, they're not a burden. You just want to be present to them, telling them also, like, this is something in my own experiences of depression that really mattered to me, like having friends who said, you can call me anytime if you just need to chat, if you just need, to hear somebody else talk for a while, get out of your head a little bit. Those are, to me, examples of just the gift of presence that can make such a difference to people. I think also something that I find myself offering to friends who are experiencing depression that people take me up on with surprising regularity is I often offer to help people find mental health care. So I mentioned this earlier that I would love to see churches do this in a more kind of official capacity, but it's just like, when people are really sick with other health conditions, they know they need to see the doctor, but they feel so sick that they can't do the work of, making an appointment. The same is often the case with people who are suffering from depression and other mental illnesses, where even people who say, I know I need to see a counselor, I know I need to see a doctor, I know I need to go to the hospital, but that feels so overwhelming. I don't even know where to start. I don't know how to deal with the insurance. I don't know, like, if you can offer to somebody, hey, I will help you do this. I will go onto the Psychology Today database and look for counselors in your area that take your insurance. And I will send you some names. I will call you back with some options and we'll go over them together. Something that simple can make a world of a difference to people because it helps them find help. The last thing that I would say for, what people can do practically for people who are suffering is, I suppose it's another version of presence, but, offering community and a sense of belonging to people is just really, really important because of the isolation of these conditions often. And so, being patient with people, continuing to invite them to things, trying to, create experiences of community for people that meet them where they are. Maybe they don't feel like going out to a restaurant, but they'd be happy to have a movie night in, or, things like that. Creating community is so important, and sustaining community is so important for people who are enduring these really difficult, isolating conditions. So being mindful of that and trying to keep people connected to others who care about them, to things they care about, even when, their own morale might be down, can be a real gift.
Yes. there's some beautiful overlap between what you're speaking about with individual things people can do, and also there's great opportunities for parish resources and parish
Mhm.
groups, and a lot of when you're talking about helping people schedule appointments, I could see that being an outreach committee at a parish or something,
Mhm.
just to give some structure to that. That's
Yeah,
beautiful and helpful.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I should mention, Michael, just because you said that, during my time in Collegeville, Minnesota, that you mentioned, I was really blessed to be invited to be a part of this incredible group of individuals who are living with a variety of mental illnesses. They gathered once a week at a diner in rural Minnesota to just talk about their lives. And this arose from a conversation that started at church, where people who knew that they were both experiencing mental illness started talking about how difficult it was to find consistent mental health care, particularly in rural communities like theirs.
Mhm.
And so they said, let's get together to support each other, but also to advocate for more resources in our community. And I mean, it was the time that I spent with this group was really holy. I mean, they were church for one another, as people say. Like, they really cared about each other and checked up on each other. And it filled a real gap in the healthcare system, but also, they would go back to their church communities. It ended up kind of being a parachurch kind of group after a while, and trying to educate their own church communities about their needs and resources. So there are even just like kind of small group opportunities here that can be great for people, and churches know how to do those kind of groups, right?
Yeah, that they're great at them. Yeah, it's definitely a place to start. Yeah,
Mhm.
wonderful. I'd like to make sure we have a little time. I know we're kind of up on the hour. Are there any questions? We had a nice comment in the chat, just thanking you, Jessica, for your professional expertise and the contributions you're making to the church. So, and I'm sure our other participants feel that way too. But I just want to make sure if there was anybody had anything to ask Jessica or to chime in, give folks a moment. Otherwise, that's fine too. Maybe Jessica, just to kind of wrap up, I know we spoke a bit about, there's prayer, there's the need for prayer, and there's also the need for more robust action. But just thinking about kind of when we all leave this evening for our evening prayer, how should we be orienting our prayer for those struggling with depression and mental health? Just starting for the next hour of our lives, how would you? I'm not saying write a prayer right now, but just a general, I don't know, how can we orient our hearts to this issue?
Oh, it's such a great question. I feel like I'm going to leave tonight thinking about that question, Michael. So thank you. I mean, for me, and this will be no surprise for anybody who reads the book, the scriptures are so important to me and to my own prayer life. And as somebody who has been educated on for numerous degrees by the Jesuits, one thing that comes to mind is the sort of Jesuit practice of bringing our imagination to our reflection on scripture, sort of imagining ourselves in the scripture. And so one thing I would invite, because we've talked about the story of Hagar, is to invite people to revisit that story, particularly in Genesis 21, and to kind of pray with that and to think about it as a story that might reveal something about who God is, and the kind of isolation and struggle that those who live with depression, the sort of contemporary wilderness experience, might be enduring. So that's one thing that comes to mind. I think when I think of what I personally pray for those who are living with depression, I often pray for patience, the gift of patience, because as we've discussed, this is a condition that makes hope difficult. But often depression sufferers tell us that, what they thought was impossible becomes possible again. They could not foresee a way to survive the condition, but as time goes on, many people do discover that there are ways to live well with depression. There are ways to survive and live better, but that requires a really difficult patience on the part of depression sufferers at times, to wait for that, to wait for things to get better.
Wait for that way out of no way. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's something that I pray a lot about. And then one last thing I'll mention, Michael, because I was just discussing this with somebody earlier, is for those who do have a chance to look at the book, one of the images that I include in it is a sculpture of Hagar, this woman in distress. And sometimes I find kind of that those sort of visual images can really ground prayer for particular people. Even the image that you so thoughtfully selected for, the event page for this, another image of Hagar. I think, if part of what I think accompaniment with depression sufferers demands is that we train our imaginations, right? That we learn to really see people who are in need and are suffering so direly. I think there are ways that images, even just, might help us kind of sit with that in a concrete way. There are people who are suffering in this way, and we can learn to be more attentive to them.
Amen.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Jessica. I guess I'm getting a little hung up on, I don't know if this phrase, because Michael said it, and I don't know if, Michael, you were paraphrasing or if this is literally, in the book or whatever, but the phrase that I'm getting hung up on in this discussion is the idea, the possibility of meaning is no meaning. Because to me, that just doesn't square with faith, because there has to be some meaning, and all the desert experiences are so rich with meaning. So I understand there's no like quick fix, but, and then also, Jessica, when you said, things like thinking about this part of God's plan, well, I don't know. I mean, I think everything is part of God's plan. It doesn't mean that we understand it. It doesn't mean that it's, like thinking about the war, for example. I mean, it's so senseless. It's impossible to see how that's part of God's plan, for example. Yet at the same time, that's what keeps me having hope, is that somehow in the darkness, there is light at some point. I don't know. I don't understand the possibility of meaning is no meaning, because that just seems to shut all the light out. And it seems to be succumbing in a way to the hopelessness. So I'm sorry. I don't understand that.
Gail, I really appreciate the question and the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, you are not alone in taking great solace in the idea that God has a plan, that even things as terrible as the war, like you mentioned, are somehow in some way that is unfathomable to us a part of God's plan. There are many people who talk about their depression that way and who feel that way. My concern is for the depression sufferers who don't. And there are other analogs. It's not just depression that kind of sometimes rouses these experiences of meaninglessness. I think also of a great deal of theological reflection on things like the Holocaust, sure, where people said, like, I don't want to talk about how this is part of God's plan. Sure. This is, counter to everything I know about God's plan and hopes for the world. And so what I'm trying to do is to to sort of name some Christian resources for people who, rather than feeling like the promise of God's plan gives them hope, it actually makes them feel like God and other Christians don't care about what they're going through. And while you're right that there are so many stories, both in the scriptures and throughout the kind of Christian tradition, about desert experiences that are imbued with meaning, one of the reasons why I lift up Hagar's story is because I think that Hagar's story is one that isn't. I think there's evidence that Hagar experiences good things in her life in the wilderness, that, you know, I wouldn't want to claim otherwise. But in terms of some revelation of God's plan or purpose, I don't see that in the text. And so I certainly would not want to say that all people need to, you know, understand their suffering is meaningless. I think that would be an unchristian thing to say. We have we have so many resources that help us understand and our lives, and to situate suffering in relation to plans and purpose and things like that. But I also think there are times when meaning is simply unfathomable, and that's all we should say about it. And that too can be a Christian thing. I think there is a unique mystery to evil and suffering. And sometimes, I think sometimes as Christians, we just need to say, like Parker Palmer, like, I don't know. I don't know. I hope there's a plan. I hope that some good will come of this, but I cannot guarantee it because I don't know. This is so horrible that I don't know. And I think there's a huge theological precedent when we're talking about God and God's relationship to the world to say, like, we don't know. We don't know.
I guess just one thing, I completely understand what you're saying about, well, we can't see a plan. Like, I can't see any plan in this senseless war going on, for example. And it's just, you know, it's just beyond anything I ever can imagine. It just is so evil. I don't know what other word to use, and senseless. However, I guess all I'm saying really is that, how do you convey to somebody who's depressed and who feels there's no plan and there's no future and there's no hope, and yet the only hope is that somehow they're, through this awful experience, they're going to draw closer to God? I guess that's all I'm saying. You know, that somehow you don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but nor do you want to just say, you know, there's no possibility of this something good coming of a very terrible situation.
Yeah, Gail, I think there's a difference between telling somebody through this experience, you will grow closer to God, and just saying more generally, like, it, you know, I hope it won't always be like this.
Right.
We have reason to believe it won't always be like this, and that you will feel closer to God again. That is our hope, that we have reason to hope that. That, I think, is an affirmation of the really good things that you want to help the person hope for. But there are people who say, like, I'm not closer to God through my depression. I'm closer to God despite my depression, right? Like it was because I was able to come out of that depression that I am able to live well and relate to God. And so I think that it's a very subtle difference, but I think that creates room for depression sufferers to kind of assign meaning to depression on their own terms.
Sure, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's really great, great thoughts.
Did you have a question?
Well, I have a comment and a question. The comment is, and Michael, you're not going to be surprised at this. Jessica, I just wrote a review of Joan Chittister's book, The Time Is Now. And my God, you are screaming out what she says we should be doing.
Ah, the time is now. I know of the book, but I haven't read it. Now it's going to the top
You
of my
should read it.
pile.
One line that really hits me, because I find this so often. I live in a senior complex. So obviously people here are mostly older, and they have this belief that if they go to mass, they're a good Catholic. And one line in her book says, going to mass and praying is not what it's all about. It's going out and being Christian. And you are screaming out in one area, okay, what we need to do to help other people.
Mhm.
You know, so read it, because you are definitely, living what she's telling us we have to do. My question for you is, I lived out at Notre Dame for 28 years. So I'm interested in your position at St. Mary's. Are you actually teaching this in the college? Oh, that is wonderful.
Yeah, I last semester taught a whole kind of advanced seminar in theology on theologies of suffering. And it was before my book had come out, but I had the students reflect on a couple kind of early chapters of it, because they were so interested in talking about mental health, as you can imagine. And, I feel very inspired by younger people today, because I mean, I'm 35. I'm not that much older than these students, but I feel a huge difference in their energy around these issues. They have just a lot more kind of basic literacy about mental illness. They feel less timid about kind of talking about their own struggles and about being proactive in getting their friends help. And it does give me hope that if we listen to these younger people as a church, that we can kind of follow their lead. I mean, they are saying we need to do something about this as a society. And I think they also, for all the talk about young people being jaded with the church, I think that many of my students still look to the church as a place that should care deeply about suffering, and that does have resources for thinking about their own suffering. And so, I hope that they will continue to turn to faith communities and push us to do the hard thing, like you're saying, Beverly, to do more than just the lip service.
I have a question. I can't get my camera to work, but I'll ask it anyway. I have one of my theological pet peeves is the fact that we continue to think of God in anthropomorphic ways, and therefore we have human expectations from God. So my question is, if you're trying to help people with depression, is it helpful or harmful to disabuse them of their anthropological notions of God? In other words, is it helpful or is it harmful to say to people, God is a spirit. He's not a giant human being. God is a spirit. So we can't expect from him what we expect from our neighbor, for example. What I think Gail said at one point, everything is in God's plan. And I believe that. I believe that everything is in God's plan, even the horrible stuff. But if you try to say that to somebody who's depressed, I would suspect that's not helpful. But at the same time, wouldn't it be easier if more people realized that God is, he's bigger than all of this. The big picture is it is all going to be okay. but we can't visualize it because we're just human beings. All we can do is think like human beings. But
Mhm.
it's bigger than that, so to speak. I don't know if I'm even asking a question clearly enough. In other words, is it harmful to teach people to think of God differently than they do now? Is it going to make it harder for them?
Mhm.
Do you understand my question?
I think I do, Luke, and I'll offer an answer, and you can tell me if I haven't got it. I would say generally, I mean, one thing I believe wholeheartedly as a professor of theology is that we need to expand people's images of God, regardless of what they're going through. So I talked earlier about the importance of sort of expanding the theological narratives that we offer to people with depression. I think the more we can do that earlier on, before people are in crisis, the better. So I think, if I understand you correctly, Luke, part of your concern about anthropomorphic images of God is that it leads people to expect things of God that are kind of misleading, perhaps, or inadequate.
Exactly.
And so I think it would be great if in our everyday church lives we were offering people really expansive images of God. That said, I don't know if when people are in crisis, that's the best time to ask them to surrender images of God that they are familiar with, particularly because some anthropomorphic images of God bring people tremendous comfort, even if they are only, analogies, right? Like we know that when we say God is Father, that God is not a literal father. People are saying there are aspects of who God is that are father-like or fatherly, right? So too with all these other anthropomorphic images. And I'm thinking particularly of a UCC pastor and depression sufferer, David Finnegan Hosey, who talks about being in a psych ward, struggling with depression. And he talks about how he came to see God as a nurse, like the care that his nurse extended to him, he felt like was an embodiment of the kind of love that he was taught to associate with the God of his Christian faith. In a moment like that, I wouldn't want to take that from anybody. You know what I mean, Luke? And so I think the more we can do early on to expand people's theological imaginations, to help them see God more expansively, to help them understand the ways that God relates to the world, sometimes in ways that are very different than human ways of relating, that can only help people when they get to that crisis, I think.
I think that you've answered me perfectly. I appreciate that.
Good.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear. That it doesn't help in the moment to start teaching theology about God, but way back in the beginning, when you're a little kid and you're exposed to homilies and to catechisms, that's when it's helpful, but not helpful to dump on a depressed person about God is just a spirit. You really, thank you very much for doing that. That's been very helpful to me. Thanks.
Good. Thanks for the great question, Luke.
Thank you, Luke.
Jessica, can I just ask you one more question? When Gail brought up the question of the Holocaust, I think Gail was the one that did. And obviously, when we look at what's going on today, is there anything wrong with saying that this particular thing is not part of God's plan? God gave all of us a free will. And we can do what we want. Right now, Putin is doing what he wants.
Mm-hmm.
And he can do that because he has free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Beverly, that is one very traditional way of talking, of like giving an explanation for how things like this happen. And one of the appeals of it is, I think, what you're intuiting, which is that it names our moral agency. It names our responsibility for causing such harm, but also for doing otherwise, right?
Mhm.
So it's a very traditional way of talking about this. And in that sense, it's a viable Christian way of talking about this. The one reservation that I would name, that some people would name, that's worth considering, is that attributing this to human will also doesn't, it just brings up different theological problems. Like, why would God allow people to exercise their human will in such devastating ways?
Sure.
Right? It can also give this image of a God who is sort of very removed and even indifferent to human agent, like to human action. Like, why doesn't God intervene? Does God not care? Why is some people's free will more important than other people's suffering? All this is to say that I think it is a traditional explanation for evil, but I think we would be misguided in thinking that it actually resolves some of the mystery that exists around the reality of evil and suffering. And I think part of why I spend a lot of time in the book sort of talking about the possibility of meaningless suffering, it's not because I think all suffering is meaningless. It's because I think we're not very accustomed as Christians to recognizing, like, even the explanations we have leave so much up to mystery.
Mhm.
And I think we would maybe gain something if we were more honest about that. That would free us up to do other things if we were more honest about the things we can't explain. So I hope that helps with your question, Beverly. It's another really good one.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. We're
Well,
kind of,
thank you. Yeah.
yeah,
Thank
we're
you.
coming up on around our Zoom time, but I wanted to just reiterate, Dust in the Blood, Dr. Jessica Coblentz, seek it out. Jessica, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and research and expertise with us.